across America there's people eating meat 'cause they like the way that it tastes. I do too.
But they don't know that a single pound of beef makes 100 pounds of fecal waste.
You see, the cows keep masticating and their stomachs keep digesting, and all that waste creation leaves me with one question. What you gonna do, what you gonna do, what you gonna do with all that poo? What you gonna do, what you gonna do, what you gonna do with all that poo? What you gonna do, what you gonna do, what you gonna do with all that poo? With all that doo-doo. Well, cows ate grass in their home out on the range till the land got developed into town.
That's progress. Well, now they're in the feedlot and they're eating cornflakes with some hormones to wash them down. The breakfast of champions.
Instead of fertilizing the fields where they graze, those big brown piles are rising day after day. And I say, what you gonna do, what you gonna do, what you gonna do with all that poo? What you gonna do, what you gonna do, what you gonna do with all that poo? What you gonna do, what you gonna do, what you gonna do with all that poo? With all that doo-doo.
What's up, guys? This is Mr. Mahmood, and you are now watching Ecology Video 4. We started cycles in Video 3 with the water cycle, and now we're going to get into the other two equally important cycles, probably even more important if you think about the movement of nutrients within the ecosystem, the nitrogen and the carbon cycle. So I know that video I played with you at the beginning probably seemed really out of place, but the reality is that poo has a very important place in an ecosystem. And if you take cows out of a given ecosystem and you put them in some sort of a plant or a factory, basically, where you're sitting there trying to produce as much of the meat and milk as possible, you're taking away a very important part of that ecosystem, which is their poo, right? Their waste, their organic waste. It plays a very important role in the cycling of both nitrogen and carbon. So we'll get into both of those. Thought it'd be a good way to get things started, kind of get you to loosen up a little bit before you watch the rest of the video. So as we go through this discussion, we're going to talk about two cycles, nitrogen and carbon. Both of them are very, very important, so make sure you pay attention for each. To get into the nitrogen cycle, the key terms you need to know are what you see on the screen. We're going to talk about each one in a little bit of detail and go through how they all work together. But these should be the 5 points that you are very comfortable with discussing in terms of the nitrogen cycle. Okay, it's all in a pattern, and we're very similar to the water cycle. We kind of talk about the bank where a lot of it is, and then how it moves within an ecosystem from there, and kind of usually all comes back to where you started. Same thing's true for both the nitrogen and the carbon cycle. So the thing about the cycles is that, as you can imagine, things are always replenished in a natural environment, except for the times when we talked about water getting out of one atmosphere to another because the environment didn't allow the cohesion of the water. But for nitrogen and carbon, usually it's pretty cyclical. And so the nitrogen and the carbon, even though it's being passed from one organism to the next and working within an ecosystem, it's constantly reused. Energy doesn't work that way. We talked about energy as being one directional, right? That means energy is absorbed by the plants, used as a means to produce chemical energy, and those sugars are used at every single trophic level and only a very small amount. Remember that 10% moves on. That's not the case with nitrogen and carbon. Those things are constantly cycling through an ecosystem. Very important that they pass through. So for nitrogen, we're going to talk about these 5 components of how that happens. All right. The main reason we need nitrogen is because of its key role in the structural properties for DNA, for the components of DNA, and ultimately the production of proteins. So all of these things in terms of your body are obviously extremely important. We're going to talk about how important they are in the second semester. But for now, you just need to understand that your body needs proteins, and your body at the cellular level makes massive amounts of proteins and requires those massive amounts of proteins to let your cell perform its normal function. So if you don't have the nitrogen that's needed to be brought in from outside, you're not going to be able to produce all of the necessary proteins of your body. And then if the other structure that's essential, or that nitrogen is essential for in terms of how it's made, are the bases that are in the middle of a DNA molecule. Those bases are called nitrogen bases or nitrogenous bases, nitrogenous, however you want to say it. Those are structural components that are made of nitrogen as one of the key elements. So those things have to be present in high amounts. The nitrogen has to be present in high amounts in every single cell in order for you to function properly. You make and reuse some nitrogen, but the rest of it has to be brought in from the outside environment. Here's the deal, and it's kind of ironic here. The air you breathe is almost all nitrogen. It's about 79% nitrogen. When you're breathing in air, you're breathing in mostly nitrogen. The problem is it's in the form of something called free nitrogen, a diatom. Free nitrogen is something that your body cannot break down and cannot turn into the nitrogen parts of structures necessary for DNA and for proteins. So it's ironic, right? You have all this free nitrogen that's available. We need nitrogen, so why not just breathe it in and use it? It's just our body's not made for it. So we breathe in 79%, we breathe out 79%. We utilize the oxygen, we exhale excess carbon dioxide, that you're probably familiar with. But the nitrogen itself really serves no direct purpose for us. We can't do anything with it. We do need nitrogen, but it's not in the form of free nitrogen. So that means we depend entirely on our microbe friends, our microorganism friends, specifically types of bacteria that can take that free nitrogen that's in the air and turn it into a form of nitrogen that our body can actually use. Okay, we'll get into that as well. So that free nitrogen that's in the air is what we consider our atmospheric bank, kind of like the accumulation of water in a water cycle. It's where you start with a lot of something. We have a whole lot of nitrogen. We need nitrogen, but we can't use it in the form of free nitrogen. So instead, we depend on types of bacteria to go through a process called nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is the conversion of free nitrogen in the air into something we call nitrates. Nitrate means it has nitrogen and oxygen. So instead of it being N2, like the free nitrogen, it's NO2 or NO3 that has nitrogen and oxygen together. That chemical structure is something that our body is capable of chemically breaking down and using to convert into the parts necessary to make our bases for DNA and the amino acids for our proteins. So we need a type of bacteria that's capable of doing that for us. And luckily, in every ecosystem on Earth, there are high populations of these types of bacteria that go through nitrogen fixation. So the scientists aren't trying to mess you up here. They named the bacteria after what they do. So we just call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. So nitrogen fixing bacteria are capable of going through nitrogen fixation, which is the process of going from free nitrogen in the air to the nitrates that our body can actually use. So we need nitrogen. We can use it in the form of nitrates. The air that we breathe has a whole lot of free nitrogen but no nitrates. So we depend on the bacteria to convert the free nitrogen into nitrates. So now we have nitrates that are present, usually in the soil, because that's where the bacteria survive. So now we have all this nitrate available in the soil. So we as animals have, or consumers, or heterotrophs, have a couple of options. One, we can eat dirt, right? You can just go scoop out a handful of dirt, and go to your backyard right now, grab a scoop of dirt and eat it. You'll get your nitrates that way. Or you can let the plants that naturally absorb nutrients from the soil through their roots absorb those nitrates that are being broken down and produced around them by that nitrogen fixing bacteria. Once the plants get their nitrates, how do you think the rest of an ecosystem would be able to get those nitrates? Think about energy. Once the plants make their chemical energy, how are all the other animals able to get the energy they need? Through their diet, through their feeding, exactly. So we need nitrogen. There's all this nitrogen in the air, but we can't use it. So the form of nitrogen that we can use, the nitrates, comes from our diet. So particularly, there's a little more detail than you need to know, but there are 20 amino acids that combine in multiple series to make all the different types of proteins that a human body or any living thing can make. Of those 20 amino acids, we consider 8 of them essential amino acids. That means they're amino acids that your body is not capable of just regenerating within itself. 12 of them your body can just regenerate within itself, kind of recycling what's available. The other 8 are constantly needing to be brought in from the outside environment. So it's not just true for us, but that's true for all other organisms. The idea here is, imagine the alphabet has 26 letters, right? What if I told you that for the rest of the night, you couldn't use the first 8 letters of the alphabet? It wouldn't be very easy, right? Now you're thinking about all the words and trying to put words together that don't have those particular letters because they're no longer available. That's how your body would work if it wasn't getting the essential nitrates from your diet. It would be forced to focus in on the 12 amino acids and not be able to use the 8. And our body doesn't function in a way where it can make decisions like that. Your body is very specific about the types of proteins that it makes. If you don't have certain amino acids available, your body can't function. So if you don't have the nitrates coming in, your body can't function. This is very, very important. So your body converts free nitrogen, so bacteria converts free nitrogen into nitrates through nitrogen fixation. To fix the nitrogen means to convert it from free nitrogen to nitrate. So now once the nitrates are present in the soil, plants can absorb those nitrates. So they get the nitrates they need. They have their 8 essential amino acids, so they can make all the proteins they need and can make all their DNA. And then as animals and consumers begin feeding off of each other in those plants, as the energy is being passed, so are the nitrates. So nitrates are being passed on as well from one trophic level to the next and being utilized at every specific position. So at each trophic level, as you're taking in energy, you're also taking in a significant amount of nitrates, and those nitrates are being used to help produce the proteins you need and help create your DNA. So we have free nitrogen being converted through nitrogen fixation. The bacteria that's capable of doing that is called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Then we have the nitrates now present in the soil. Plants absorb the nitrates. Animals feed off of the plants. So now all components within an ecosystem can get the nitrates they need. Little by little, nitrates are being dispersed, and that's where the poo comes in. That poo plays an important role because when you release your fecal matter, you are releasing some nitrates back into the environment. Typically, if we're talking about a natural ecosystem, we're talking about animals releasing their poo back into the soil around them. Plants can reabsorb them, and things can kind of recycle that way. Another important way that they recycle is bringing in another key term that hopefully you guys picked up on from the energy flow discussion, and that's a decomposer. Decomposers play very important roles in both the nitrogen and the carbon cycle. The role of a decomposer is to break down dead or decaying matter and absorb nutrients away from that dead matter. If it wasn't for decomposers, when an organism died, everything about them would die with it. But in a natural environment, decomposers can pull nutrients out of those dead or decaying organisms so that those elements can be recycled back into the ecosystem. So not only are we depending on them pooing to get rid of the nitrates and put it back into the soil, but if and when organisms die, decomposers present in the soil or in the area around it, whether that be bacteria or fungi, those are two kingdoms that we'll get into in the next unit, they'll absorb those nutrients away, like nitrogen and like the carbon, and allow those things to get back into the soil or back into the atmosphere, depending on what we're talking about. So as the plants and the animals die here towards the end of this progression that I'm showing you, the nitrates are put back into the soil and are now back into the ecosystem. Now, just like any bank account, if all you did was pull money out of a bank account and you never deposited money in, you're eventually going to run out of money, right? So just like that in any other cycle, if you're constantly pulling out from the bank and not putting it back, you're going to run out. That's why we have drought problems in the summer with our water cycle. Like we said, there's a lot of evaporation and transpiration pulling water out of our earth and the lakes, but that water is not coming back. So eventually we're running out of water, and now we have this super dry land, low lakes, and serious problems. Same thing's true with the nitrogen cycle. If all we did was convert free nitrogen into nitrates, or let the bacteria do it, and then utilize all of these nitrates, we'd be great for a while, but eventually what's going to happen? We're going to run out of free nitrogen. So in order to keep the cycle moving, we have to get things back to where we started. So just like we said, there are types of bacteria that are capable of converting free nitrogen into nitrates, which we call nitrogen fixation. There's another type of bacteria that's capable of doing the opposite. So it's kind of an equal share. Once the nitrates, as the nitrates are present in the soil as well, you have almost an equal amount of this other category of bacteria called denitrifying bacteria that convert the nitrates back into free nitrogen to keep the cycle moving. So it's important that you understand there are two categories of bacteria that are essential in the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen fixing bacteria that converts the free nitrogen that we cannot use into nitrates that we can, and then the denitrifying bacteria that keeps the proper proportion of nitrogen in the air by taking a lot of that nitrates that's in the soil that's usually in excess and getting it back into the atmosphere in the form of free nitrogen. So they do the opposite of nitrogen fixation. They go through a process called denitrification. So the organisms, the bacteria that go through denitrification, again, we made this as easy as possible for you, we call them denitrifying bacteria. It's the opposite of nitrogen fixation, which is why it's called denitrification. Convert the NOs back into free nitrogens to get released back up into the atmosphere. So everything starts over, now you have your free nitrogen in the air, and the whole cycle happens again. So it's very important you understand the key parts of the nitrogen cycle. You have the free nitrogen in the air that we cannot use, the nitrogen fixation, which is the process of bacteria converting the free nitrogen into nitrates. Once the nitrates are in the soil, plants can then absorb the nitrates through their roots. They can use the nitrates to make their amino acids and make all of their proteins and DNA. Then all of the consumers feed off of the plants or feed off of each other and gain nitrates through their diet. And again, now they're happy, they get everything they need to get the nitrates to their cells so they can make all the proteins and DNA they need as well. Then over the course of their life, their poo plays an important role getting those nitrates back into the soil so plants can reabsorb them, and some of the denitrifying bacteria can take some of those nitrates and keep the proportion of free nitrogen in the air normal. And then if and when the organisms die, we have decomposers that are very important to help pull away any of the excess nitrates that would then otherwise be trapped in that organism forever. So those nitrates are pulled back out, usually back into the soil. So there's constantly a good proportion of nitrates in the soil, and because of denitrifying bacteria, a good proportion of free nitrogen back in the air. It's important you have an equal concentration of nitrogen in the air as well, because the other gases that are very important, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and others, have to have that same consistency. If you start pulling away from the amount of free nitrogen, that changes proportions of oxygen, and then you can have some pretty serious problems with the ecosystem because of that. So it's important that you have a kind of an equal balance of free nitrogen and nitrates. But we can only use the nitrates. So nitrogen cycle, very important. Make sure you know the parts of it and you understand how the nitrates that we use are made and eventually put back into free nitrogen. And again, the importance of poo. Very important to get that, get a lot of those nutrients, a little bit at least, back into the soil to keep the cycle moving so that we don't just depend on waiting for things to die to pull nitrates out. Okay? Obviously, I'm not telling you to go take a poo in your backyard or anything, but in a natural environment, those wastes actually serve a purpose. And you've probably heard of using fertilizers for growing grass and things like that, because those nitrates are very important for having healthy producers and getting them to be able to function properly. So here's another diagram that kind of shows you a couple of different ways that nitrates move through. This is a little more detailed than you need to worry about, but there is something called lightning fixation, where just the electrical energy that's in a lightning bolt is actually strong enough to do what bacteria are capable of doing, which is convert free nitrogen in the air into nitrates. So as the lightning bolt strikes and the electric current passes through, the free nitrogen that it's hitting in the air can actually convert into nitrates and combine with the oxygen that's in the air, and it can do the job for us instead of bacteria sometimes. So lightning strikes and thunderstorms aren't always a bad thing. The lightning can actually help fixate a little bit of the nitrogen for us and convert it into nitrates. So you have these nitrates into the soil. The plants again absorb those nitrates, so animals can feed off of the plants, and all of the nitrates pass through the ecosystem, through a food chain. And then as organisms release their organic matter, whether they're living or as they die, with plants, when their leaves fall and things like that, they have nitrates that fall as well, and those release back into the soil. So one way or the other, throughout their lifetime, they're releasing nitrates back into the soil, and then when they die, decomposers play a very important role and pull out a lot of that nitrate that's left so that it can be either passed back into another plant to be absorbed and go back through the ecosystem, or for the denitrifying bacteria, like you see on the left here, to take those free nitrogen and convert it back into, to take those nitrates and convert it back into the free nitrogen. Okay, so nitrogen cycle, very important. Make sure you know all the parts. This diagram just kind of walks you through the differences in when you'd see the free nitrogen compared to the nitrates. The brown spots represent the nitrates. The white spots represent free nitrogen. So it shows you how there are different organisms that are capable of helping to convert the free nitrogen into the nitrates. And once you have the nitrates in the soil, it's there for plants to absorb and animals to feed off of, and decomposers to take out of dead and decaying organisms. And then the denitrifying bacteria there on the right are capable of taking that nitrates and getting it back into free nitrogen, keeping the cycle going. All right, so that's the nitrogen cycle. Carbon cycle works in a very similar way. It's all about taking that element and allowing it to be kind of consistently passing within an ecosystem. Carbon cycle is being messed with a lot more than the nitrogen cycle. Yeah, taking cows away from their natural environment takes a lot of nitrates with them, so what are you going to do with all that poo now that it's not there for presence, right? But the carbon cycle itself, with modern technology and with a lot of things that we're doing, we're messing with this a lot more than we're messing with the nitrogen cycle, and there's some very serious side effects that could eventually develop because of this that we're already starting to feel some effects of. So we're going to walk through some of the basics on the carbon cycle. These are the points you need to make sure you know. These are basically 5 different ways that carbon is transported within an ecosystem, whether it's being released, brought in, whatever it is. 5 different ways that carbon is moving within an ecosystem. These terms you're probably more familiar with than the nitrogen cycle. You've probably heard every one of these one way or another before. We're going to get into each one as we discuss how the carbon cycle works. So basically it's all about carbon movement. Okay? Now when we talk about the carbon cycle, now we can talk about both living and non-living factors. With the nitrogen cycle, pretty much everything was biotic or living. Talking about bacteria that go through the process of denitrification or fixation, plants that absorb the nitrates, animals that feed off of them. Most everything in that discussion is biotic, with the exception of maybe the lightning in the weather and the clouds helping to fixate some of the nitrogen. Carbon cycle actually deals with both living and non-living components of an ecosystem. So we're not just talking about carbon dioxide, which is what you're probably most familiar with in terms of a form of carbon that your body is constantly interacting with, or in our case, what we're making as a waste product. It's not always just carbon dioxide. We're going to talk about multiple forms of carbon and how they're used in the ecosystem and how they're passed through. So it's again the same situation. We have a bank where a lot of carbon is present, and we're talking about how the different components either pull from the bank or add to the bank. So let's walk through this. The basic components of the carbon cycle, there are 5, are going to be combustion, erosion, decomposition, respiration, and photosynthesis. All of them play important roles in carbon. But of the 5, 4 of them are actually pulling carbon or putting more carbon into the atmosphere. Only 1 actually pulls carbon out. So this idea of a cycle and keeping an equal balance on both sides, it's becoming much less of a balance if we're not working hard to keep the 4 that are responsible for releasing carbon about equal to the 1 that's responsible for pulling the carbon out. When I say out, I mean bringing it back down to the earth compared to releasing it back into the atmosphere. So there are 4 ways that carbon is released in the atmosphere. First way is through combustion. Combustion is the burning of fossil fuels. So when fossil fuels are burned, they release multiple gases. The most important one here is usually carbon monoxide, M-O-N-O-X-I-D-E. Carbon monoxide is a noxious gas. It's very, very poisonous if it's in high concentration. That gas is being released out into the atmosphere anytime basically a fire or any kind of combustion or burning occurs. It can happen a number of different ways. It happens naturally when we talk about volcanic eruptions or any kind of release of that kind of heat energy to produce a fire, natural forest fire, something like that. But more recently, there are 2 major man-made components that lead to massive amounts of combustion. One is this diagram represents our factories. What do you think the other thing is that's man-made that causes massive amounts of carbon monoxide release because of combustion, specifically in engines, cars, right? So cars and factories play major roles into massively increasing the amount of combustion that occurs in a given ecosystem. So now we have a whole lot more combustion occurring than a typical ecosystem may have been used to over the course of millions of years. Now we're dealing with much more combustion because of so much more use of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are things like gasoline, oil, charcoal, natural gas, all of those different things that you've heard as an energy source. To use those things as an energy source in man-made products, you have to burn it and release that energy. You heat it up and release that energy. So that release of that energy also causes a release of carbon monoxide and other very dangerous gases. Those gases, by the way, typically tend to build in our upper atmosphere, what we call our ozone, and that building of carbon monoxide in the ozone actually causes sort of a large umbrella almost, blocking off more light than would normally be able to leave. So light is able to pass through this cloud of carbon monoxide and high amounts of carbon gases in the atmosphere, but as it comes into the atmosphere and deflects off the surface, when it goes back out, it's sort of blocked. It doesn't really allow as much of that heat energy to go out. So this is what is leading to our heating Earth, and the idea that the temperature of the Earth is increasing and significantly increasing within, say, the past 50 years. There's a massive increase in the average temperature on Earth, and it's mostly caused by this right here. The idea of combustion causing this cloud of carbon gases that blocks heat energy from leaving. So it's basically like we're living in a microwave. Heat's coming in, but it's trapped and not allowed out. So now the internal temperature is just steadily getting warmer, and it's leading to multiple problems: ice caps melting, water levels rising, and then multiple problems with weather patterns and things like that, because the warmer the water is, the more volatile the evaporation is going to be, and stronger weather, and all kinds of problems that come from this. So combustion is a very serious issue. The burning of fossil fuels causes release of carbon monoxide gas into the atmosphere. All right, a second thing is not quite as serious. You're not going to hear many news stories about this, but it's erosion. Erosion is the release of carbon through basic weather patterns, basic erosion of rocks, which is a sort of a weathering or breakdown, chipping away at the surface of rocks because of water passing or through wind or debris breaking through over a long period of time. That's why pebbles get really smooth in creeks that are fast flowing, because that water just little by little keeps chipping away at all the impurities and making the rock very smooth. So all those little chips away are components of carbon. And specifically when we talk about limestone, limestone is made of something called calcium carbonate. So that carbonate is the component of carbon that we're talking about. So erosion doesn't necessarily put carbon up into the atmosphere, but it does release carbon back into either the water or into the soil for absorption by plants to be brought back into the cycle and used for their own use. So soil erosion actually plays a pretty good role, and there's not much that we're doing to actually cause serious problems with that, except for all of our irrigation, maybe blocking the natural flow of that water and the natural expectations of how things would be weathered, right? So combustion and erosion both are about releasing carbon back into the atmosphere, right? Adding to the carbon amount into the atmosphere, adding to our bank. All right, beyond the erosion and the combustion is decomposition. We've talked about decomposition already. Remember, decomposition played an important role in the nitrogen cycle. It also plays an important role in the carbon cycle, and it does the exact same thing. It absorbs, takes dead and decaying nutrients out of the dead matter and recycles the carbon and the nitrogen back into the atmosphere or back into the soil. So again, the decomposition plays important roles both in the taking away of organisms when they're dead, as well as pulling away nitrates and carbon from waste matter. So here's that poo again, right? So once again, we're in a situation where the waste of living organisms plays an important role in recycling elements back into the soil for other organisms to use. So carbon there's no exception to carbon, just like we talked about with nitrates. As the waste products are released, absorption of nutrients can be pulled out, and decomposers play an important role pulling it out of that matter, as well as something that's actually a dead organism. One way or the other, those carbon elements are brought back out. So decomposition plays an important role in that. And if you let an organism decompose over a long period of time, a lot of the soft tissue will be broken away by the decomposers. The types of bacteria and fungi can usually pull away at a lot of the soft tissue and skin and things like that. But eventually the most dense parts of the organism aren't going to be able to be broken down. The bacteria and the fungi aren't capable of absorbing nutrients from real dense parts of animals. So specifically, if you think about a cow here, we're talking about their skeleton. So their skeleton will stick around. That's why if you ever look at the desert and things like that, you see these pictures of just skeletons of animals. It's because those animals have had a long time to allow decomposers to take away whatever they can. So now we're left with just the solid compacted matter. So now we have this compacted matter on the surface, and then little by little, you guys should know, new layers of rock to start to develop over old layers of rock because of the weathering and the wind debris and everything else. So new sediments form on top of the skeleton until eventually there's a whole new layer of the earth. And now the skeleton's a little deeper. And that earth is being pressed down because of gravity. So with more and more new rock layers forming on top of the old ones, more and more compression happens down on those the bones and the skeleton that's there. You talk about doing this for hundreds of thousands of years, and you eventually get so much compression on these bones that the bones actually start to liquefy. And that's what produces fossil fuels. That's what produces oil. That's what is used to help make gasoline. So we talk about a big oil shortage and a big problem with our obsession and our requirement or dependency on foreign oil and wanting to use oil that's found here in the United States. The problem is it takes hundreds of thousands of years to naturally create oil because of the compression of bone. So we've had hundreds of thousands of years to build up this stockpile of oil, but just in the last 100 years, again, because of cars and our technology, we're just using barrel after barrel of this oil, and we're in a position now where we're in trouble. We have a depletion of it. We don't have enough time to let new oil naturally develop. So now we need to start figuring out ways of producing synthetic oil. Now we need to start figuring out ways of providing energy for our machines without waiting for the natural process. So decomposition is what allows this natural process. They get rid of all the living tissue so that what you're left with is compacted stuff that can't be broken down by decomposers. Instead, over time, they're just compressed to produce the fossil fuels. So then if you take those fossil fuels and burn them, now we're back into combustion and the releasing of the carbon monoxide gas. So you see how this all works together. All right, so besides decomposition, respiration also releases carbon into the atmosphere. And this is probably the one you'd be most familiar with. When you exhale, you're releasing carbon dioxide gas. That carbon dioxide is a waste product that all of your cells make in the process of making your energy. So you produce all this carbon dioxide gas, it eventually filters its way through your blood, back into your heart, back to your lungs, and then when you exhale out, your lungs take the carbon dioxide with them. So now all this carbon dioxide is moving up into the atmosphere. So we're adding to our carbon bank when we're exhaling. Every time you exhale, you're releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. The key thing to understand, respiration happens for every single living organism. It's not just animals. Plants go through respiration too. Yes, they go through photosynthesis to make their sugar, but just like every other organism, they have to take the sugar and make energy, and that process releases carbon dioxide gas. So all living things release carbon dioxide gas into the atmosphere when they exhale. So with every breath you exhale, you're releasing carbon dioxide. So that's true for both animals and plants, and even in aquatic environments, all of the living organisms in there naturally release out significant amounts of carbon dioxide that eventually make it into the atmosphere. So all of these things, combustion, erosion, decomposition, and respiration, are all releasing carbon into the atmosphere. There's only one component that actually uses carbon, that actually pulls it out of the atmosphere and uses it. And that's photosynthesis. So plants and algae and maybe some types of bacteria, only the organisms that are capable of actually taking solar energy and carbon dioxide and helping to produce the sugars necessary, they're the only ways that this carbon is controlled. The only way to keep carbon from getting too high in the atmosphere is to utilize and take advantage and let plants take that carbon dioxide out and use it for themselves. So it's very important that a given ecosystem has enough plant life, enough of these producers, to pull carbon. Otherwise, we're going to start seeing this massive buildup of carbon in the atmosphere, not enough of it being pulled out. And just like with the nitrogen, if there's not a good proportion of free nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and oxygen, then the ecosystem is going to have serious problems. So a big problem that we're causing is deforestation. If you take away trees, you chop them down so you can build a mini mall or a parking lot, what are you left with? What is going to be able to take that carbon out of the atmosphere and actually help keep the carbon levels under control? Nothing. So we're doing massive things that are doing nothing but adding more carbon in the atmosphere. The combustion, releasing huge amounts of carbon monoxide into the atmosphere. So we're already at a surplus of carbon, too much carbon in the atmosphere, plus not allowing enough plants to absorb them. Those two together don't end well. That's not a positive thing for our Earth, and it's only going to get worse if we continue this process of continuing to produce machines that go through combustion, require the burning of fossil fuels, plus the deforestation of ecosystems, getting rid of the plant life so that we can urbanize it, start making skyscrapers and more concreted environments from it. So those two combined are causing very serious problems. So we're contributing to this one and the downfall of our ecosystem because of the massive amounts of carbon much more severely than the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is pretty well controlled. Yes, we pulled cows away so their poo isn't helping to recycle the nitrates, but besides that, things are pretty well controlled. The carbon, however, is a very serious issue. So I want you to understand how all five work together. 4 of the 5 all contribute to the problem, all release carbon into the atmosphere. Only 1 pulls carbon out. And if we don't have enough of that photosynthesis happening, then we're going to run into a very serious problem. So make sure you understand how it all works together. There's a final diagram to show you the different parts of the carbon cycle and how they all go together. I'll briefly try to explain what's going on here. There are a couple of red flashes that you see where it says forest fire and the burning of fossil fuels. Those red flashes, and also with breathing, animal and plant respiration, I think it kind of walks you through them. We'll do the red flashes in a second. Let's go in order. The white dots represent the actual carbon dioxide released from combustion. So those red flashes represent the burning of fuels or the quick release of heat. And then the carbon that's released out of it is what you see with the white dots. So the burning of fossil fuels and for respiration, like you see right there where it says animal and plant respiration and soil respiration as well. The blue dots represent the water. So you have water that's being absorbed by plants and moving its way up through the root and the stem of the plant, eventually to the leaves. That's where the photosynthesis actually happens. So as the water moves up into the leaf, it combines with that carbon that's in the air that's coming back down, and the light energy to actually produce the green, which are going to be the sugars as they move back down. So this is the only place where you see the blue and the white combine. That's the only place carbon is actually being pulled out of the atmosphere. That's where photosynthesis is happening. That's why it's so important. Obviously, for other reasons, photosynthesis has an important role, but it's also very important in making sure the amount of carbon dioxide in the air isn't too high. And you need plenty of plants to really make sure that happens, especially if you produce more combustion and the burning of fossil fuels. So like we said, the green dots represent the sugars that are being made after photosynthesis coming back down and being released out into the soil if it's excess, and then otherwise the plants are being eaten by other animals, and that's how energy passes through the ecosystem, the food chain and food webs that we've talked about. And then those red dots, like you said, are the release of the combustion, heating and the burning of fossil fuels that'll cause them to move into the white, which would be the carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide if we're talking about basic respiration. Alright, so that's the basic breakdown of the carbon cycle. We've already talked about the nitrogen cycle. Both of them are extremely important in the natural control of an ecosystem. If the slightest changes occur, then they could be severely detrimental for that ecosystem. We have caused much more of a drastic change to the carbon cycle than we have to the nitrogen cycle, but both of them are very important in the functioning of all organisms within it. So please make sure you know the parts of the nitrogen and carbon cycle. Again, make sure you know the water cycle as well, and how they all play important roles within a given ecosystem to keep that balance, to keep everything where it should be. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you next time.